Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. One of the things I'm excited to dig into today is if Jesus declared that we could pray for whatever we want and have it. If you look at his words, it seems like that's exactly what he's saying. Today, we're looking at Matthew 20 and 21. There's a lot of familiar stories in here. There are some things that don't match up, and there is some instances of Jesus not being very Jesus-like. So there's a lot to dig into here today, and I'm excited to do it. So we've already talked some about one of the first things you'll see when we read through here is this mother's request that the mom of James and John are asking that they can sit at Jesus' left and right hand. We already talked about that a little bit, kind of the scandal of who is the best, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. The first thing I want to talk about is here in Matthew 20, verse 29, there seems to be another biblical inconsistency. If you remember, we read in Mark 10, there was one blind man who was calling out to Jesus to be healed. He was actually named. His name was blind Bartimaeus. But here, there are two blind men calling out to Jesus. The story is basically the same. And the difference is in Mark 10, there is one guy. And in Matthew 20, there is two guys. I do think, unfortunately for Matthew, this is another instance of Matthew stretching the details a little bit. Maybe misremembering something, maybe making it seem like this was like a much more significant event than it was. I mean, obviously, Jesus is healing a blind man. That's pretty significant. But this is one of those biblical inconsistencies that people will point out. And unfortunately for Matthew, a lot of times it is him who is guilty of the inconsistencies. Or I guess you could say that Mark is guilty. Take your pick. You can decide who you want to believe. At any rate, it doesn't take away from the actual teaching of the story. Like it just because there's one guy who's healed from his blindness or there's two guys who's healed from their blindness, it's pretty safe to assume that in this instance, somebody, at least one person, called out to Jesus and asked to be healed of being blind and was given his sight back. So it doesn't take away from who Jesus is. It just makes us kind of wrestle with the text a little bit. I know for me personally, it just makes me think, oh, well, come on, Matthew, why didn't you get your details straight here? But it doesn't take away from the theology or what is being taught. I'm not going to try to do gymnastics to say this is two different instances. I suppose it could be two different instances, but I think here it's just a mix-up of the details. This was written down after the events, like years after the events, and so I think it's easy to chalk it up as misremembered or stretching things, which I think Matthew is guilty of, if you've heard me talk about that before. The next thing that I'm interested in is another one that could be sort of a slight change of details, I suppose. Jesus rides in on a donkey. He fulfills prophecies. Because of that, he is praised as the coming Messiah by the crowds. This is basically Palm Sunday. But what he does in Matthew 21 is he rides right up to the temple and storms into the temple and throws people out of it. You could chalk this up as another inconsistency because John has this story recorded much earlier on in Jesus' ministry, where the other Gospels have this happening later. There are people who believe John put the story at the beginning of his Gospel to help make the case that Jesus is coming to set things right. There's other people who will argue that this actually happened twice. And so you can kind of take your pick on that. Again, what Jesus is teaching is more important than when it happened because we can be fairly confident that it did happen. What's interesting here is that what's actually happening in the temple is that these money changers are located in the outer courts. And in the outer courts is where kind of like poor people and foreigners and people who are coming to seek God from far away or just people who don't know who God is are coming to kind of see what this religious experience is all about. These money changers would have been selling them sacrifices to make to God. And the thing that was happening here is that these money changers were charging these foreigners or these non-believers an exorbitant amount of money to be able to take place in these sacrifices. So what is significant here is, yes, they are trying to sell things and they are trying to make money, and Jesus takes issue with that. But probably what Jesus takes even greater issue with is that there are people who are trying to come and worship God through sacrifice, and these basically like robbers are taking advantage of them and taking advantage of their move toward faith. And so Jesus is furious because he sees these people moving toward God, desiring to make sacrifices, and yet there are other people who are just taking advantage of them, trying to get rich off of them. And so Jesus drives them out. He throws over their tables and cleanses the temple. This is another story that always gets my attention, because when people talk about how Jesus is always kind and always loving, I would guess that these folks that were selling things in the temple would probably not agree with that. It seems like Jesus is a little upset. And one of the Gospels, Jesus actually makes whips and drives these guys out with whips. So this is no small thing. He is calling them a den of robbers and throwing them out because he is passionate for the correct worship of God and that people would not be taken advantage of. And so he drives them out. So then he comes upon this fig tree, this poor fig tree. This is Matthew 21, starting in verse 18. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves, and said to it, "May no fruit ever come on you again." And the fig tree withered at once. So basically, Jesus is hungry. He walks up to this fig tree, and he just flat out curses the tree. There is some debate about if this is fair or not, because it may not have even been fig season. But a lot of people draw attention to the fact that this tree has leaves on it. This tree is essentially drawing attention to itself that it could bear fruit, but when Jesus finds it, it does not bear fruit. So Jesus curses the tree dies on the spot. This shocks the disciples. So probably what's going on here is that this is all symbolism, because the fig tree kind of stood for the nation of Israel. And Jesus here is showing that the nation of Israel has opportunity to be fruitful, but is refusing to bear fruit because they're refusing to recognize the power of Jesus, recognize the identity of Jesus as God's son, and they'll be cursed and judged because of it. So just like this fig tree is cursed and judged, so will the nation of Israel for turning its back on Jesus. Now the disciples see this and they are shocked, and they want to know if they can do it too. And Jesus tells them this thing that can be sort of a misleading verse, I think. If you look in verse 21, we'll just pick it up from there. And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." This verse can be misleading. It can be misused because it does say directly, if you ask for things in prayer, you will receive it if you have faith. But it's always important to keep these in context, not only with the immediate context, like Jesus is saying this in response to this fig tree analogy, but also within the context of what Jesus has been preaching in his ministry about prayer. Basically, yes, if we ask for things and we have faith and believe in Jesus, God hears our prayers and honors our prayers, but also God is a God who gives us what we need when we need it. So I just recently read kind of an example that is like, as a parent, when your kids come and ask you for things, they ask you because they know you have authority to give things. And a lot of times what they're asking for is things that you really could give them. But as a parent, you decide what they need and when they need it, and you do not always give it. So it's very important not to take this verse out of context and not to make this verse mean something that it does not mean. People that will take this to extremes and say, hey, the Bible says that you can declare whatever you desire and God will give it to you if you have faith. So if you are praying for something and you are not receiving that thing, it's because you do not have enough faith, and therefore you should have faith. So if you ever experience this, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because sometimes it can have really negative effects on people's lives. And this is not what Jesus intended. I think Jesus here is teaching that when you have faith in God, yes, he does answer your prayers, but it is important that your prayers always align with what he intends. And the trick is we don't know what he intends. There's basically, I think, two extremes on this. The one extreme side is that you just pray and declare things all the time, and you kind of make yourself your own God. Like you declare that this is yours. You assume that it's yours and you should have it because of your faith. And that's where, like, okay, really in that situation, you have become God. The other extreme side of this is where you never seek God. You just assume everything is your lot in life. You can't have any kind of relationship with God, so you just never pray or you never expect. We don't really want to fall into either of those. Jesus clearly teaches in his ministry that we can ask him for things, and he is a loving Father who loves to give us the things that we need when we need them. And so it shouldn't prevent us from praying, but also we shouldn't be doubting him or who he is when we don't receive exactly what we think. So I'm excited to bring a little bit of clarity to that passage because I think it is kind of a tricky passage. And to wrap this all up, Jesus tells this really powerful story of the tenant of a vineyard and how this guy kind of sets up this area that people are tenants of this like wonderful vineyard and farm. And he continues to send out messengers to these people to collect what's his. But the people just stone and hurt and cast out his messengers. And so eventually the owner of the land sends his own son, and the people actually kill his son. And the moral of the story is basically like the owner of this land will bring judgment against the tenants. And obviously this is a vision or a picture of how God will handle those who choose to kill Jesus. Like this is alluding to the fact that Jesus is going to give his life for our sin. And ultimately, when we reject the Son, the owner of the land, God himself, will judge us for that sin. So it's just a reminder to trust Jesus and follow him. And I guess really, as far as your parts for today, that is kind of the main takeaway. Like trust Jesus with your life. Trust Jesus with your problems. We can pray to him. We can expect that he hears our prayers. He cares about our concerns, and he will care for us as his children because he is a good father. So I hope you're encouraged by that. We'll be back in tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.